Hello, readers, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Tammy Marshall, and today I'm going to share the first chapter of my very first book, which was The Clearwater House. This one is the one about the artist who inherits a house from a woman she doesn't know. In the first chapter, we see that happen. So I'm going to share with you the first chapter. If you haven't viewed the prologue already, the video is already on the channel for you to watch whenever you can. It is a little bit long, this first chapter, so I hope you bear with me. But here is chapter 1 of The Clearwater House. Lillian cocked her head to one side as she examined the 3 paintings she had just hung in the museum's foyer to preview a larger collection of works by the same artist that would be on display next month. She stepped back a bit further, not quite liking what she saw. Something with the arrangement was off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Perhaps if you put the large one on an easel and left more space around the 2 smaller ones, they'd be more eye-catching, a voice behind her said. She nodded, letting her curator's eye visualize the arrangement. That might work. She turned to see who had spoken to her and found herself looking down at a short, rotund, jocular-looking man who was wearing a too-tight suit. Are you a patron of the arts? He chuckled. Goodness, no, I don't know a Monet from a Manet, but my wife loves to decorate, so I've learned to spot a good arrangement. She smiled down at him, and when he appeared to be lost in thought, she turned her attention back to the task at hand and started to move away. I'm looking for Lillian Chase, the man said. She turned back toward him, her smile now one of puzzlement. I'm Lillian Chase. He offered his hand and she shook it. I thought you might be. You looked like the description I'd been given by the guard out front. Medium height, blondish hair, attractive in an understated way, about 30. Lillian interrupted him. And who are you? Oh dear, forgive me for being addled. I'm not used to going out and finding people. Clients usually come to me. Clients? Yes, I'm a lawyer. My name is Alex McHale, and I represent Dorothy Meyer. He blinked and smiled up at her, and then quickly became addled again as a sculpture caught his eye. Oh, that's lovely. Is it for sale? What? She followed his gaze. Oh, no. This is a museum. The artwork here is for display, not for sale. He nodded. Oh, yes, of course. I forgot where I was. Seeing she was getting nowhere with him and wanting to get away from co-workers, she suggested, Why don't we continue this conversation in my office, Mr. McHale? He tugged on the lapels of his well-worn suit jacket and grinned. Oh, please, call me Alex. He then bowed ever so slightly and said, After you, Miss Chase. Shaking her head in bewilderment, she headed down an adjacent hallway that led away from the main viewing rooms. She entered her office and waited for the attorney to follow her before shutting the door. As he passed the door, he glanced up and almost squealed. Curator? Well, isn't that impressive, Miss Chase? Please, call me Lillian. She gestured for him to have a seat, and he did, bouncing a bit to test the cushiness of the padding. Then he raised his eyebrows at her and said, Very nice office you have here. She glanced around, seeing it anew, and nodded in agreement. It was a nice office, but it wasn't where she wanted to be, so she didn't give it much thought on a day-to-day basis. She seated herself behind her cluttered desk and asked, So, what brings you here? You mentioned a woman before, a Dorothy something or other? Meyer, he reminded her. Yes, I represent her, have for many years, and she has named you as the primary beneficiary in her will. He leaned back in the chair and peered at her over his hands that he had tented upon his ample belly. She shook her head in confusion, racking her brain for any recollection of knowing somebody with that name. Finally, she asked, Was she a longtime member of this museum? Is she leaving her money as an endowment? He chuckled. Oh, goodness, no. I doubt she's ever even been here. No, she's leaving her property to you. Lillian scowled. I don't understand, Mr. McHale. Alex, he reminded her. Alex, she acquiesced with an impatient smile. I don't know this woman. He shrugged. Well, she certainly knows you, so that's what's important, right? Lillian was at a loss of what to say. Finally, she said, Property? Did you say property? He winked at her. Oh, good. You were paying attention. Suddenly, he pulled a large, wrinkled packet from his battered briefcase. He extended it across the desk to Lillian, who hesitantly took it from him. Everything you need to know about the place is in there. Dorothy has bequeathed some land and a house in rural northeastern Nebraska to you. It's not a substantial piece of property. A somewhat run-down old farmhouse, a couple of outbuildings, a pasture. All told, I believe it's 25 acres. Looking in complete bafflement at the crumpled envelope on her desk, she again said, "But I don't know this woman." Alex McHale chuckled heartily. "What can I say? Who can explain the idiosyncrasies of the old?" Lillian furrowed her brow. I thought this was about her will. So I hate to be blunt, but isn't this woman dead or not just old?" The lawyer hooted and slapped his knee. "Ha! You'd think that would be the case, wouldn't you? But not this time. No, my dear, Dorothy is very much alive. However, she wants everything cleared up before she dies. She's been most insistent. In fact, she called me this very morning to remind me that I needed to come see you." "Does she live around here?" "Oh, no, The attorney faded off and then grinned mischievously at her. "Oh, you almost tricked me." She blinked in confusion and waited for him to continue. When he didn't, she asked, "Where does she live? I'd like to meet her and see if somehow I actually do know her. And if I don't, then I'd like to know why she wants me to have her property." Mr. McHale leaned back in his chair again, which squeaked in alarm. He peered down his nose and across his girth at her and gave her a wry smile. "Well, that may be a problem. I get the sense that she doesn't want to meet you, at least not until after you accept the property." Lillian was more than puzzled over the turn of events. She glanced down at the unopened envelope. "Just where is this house?" she questioned cautiously. He stood and ambled over to study some facsimiles of famous artworks hanging on her walls. "It's located south of a small town called Clearwater." He stepped closer to peer at a reproduction of Las Meninas, but suddenly jumped back in alarm as she bolted out of her chair. "Clearwater? Nebraska, right? Not Florida." When she saw him nod as he clutched at his chest, she sank back down into her chair and stared at him dumbfounded. "You're kidding, right?" "Why do you say that?" the lawyer asked as he returned to his chair. "My grandfather grew up in Clearwater. My parents met there. I've been meaning to go visit my grandfather for some time now. He lives in a nursing home in the town next to Clearwater." The lawyer was pleasantly surprised. "Then you should have no trouble finding the place, should you?" He smiled at her. "No, I suppose not." She tried to smile in return, but the whole situation seemed so weird to her that her puzzled thoughts inhibited her smile. "I still don't get it, though. Do you know why Dorothy Meyer wants me to have this property?" He shrugged and picked a piece of dried food off his coat. "I'm not sure, but I know that she wants you to go and check it out to decide if you'll accept it or not. She wants you to have it, but she doesn't want you to feel burdened by it." "All right, I suppose I can at least do that." She thought out loud. "Tomorrow's Friday. I get up early on Fridays. I was planning to work late, though, to catch up on things. But being behind in my work will be nothing new." She grinned self-consciously. The attorney chuckled and said, "I know what you mean." He brought the conversation to a close by standing suddenly. He tapped the crumpled packet and said, "In here is all the information you'll need, Miss Chase, including directions on how to get there, descriptions of the buildings, layout of the land. Apparently there is a small stream running in back of the house. Do you fish?" He paused and she shook her head, so he continued, "And several photos of the house. I'm sure you'll find it useful and have no trouble locating the place. If you have any further questions, my card is included." She looked at the innocuous exterior of the large envelope, sensing that despite its innocent facade, it contained something life-altering for her. She shook off the feeling, though, and told herself that it was just a house, and that there was clearly some mistake, since she didn't know anyone by the name of Dorothy Meyer. "Thank you," she said as she stood and walked him to the door. They shook hands. "Be sure to call me as soon as possible with your decision. If you don't want the house, then Dorothy will have to change her will." He grinned maliciously at her and added, "Before she actually is dead." She reddened slightly and nodded. "I'll call you on Monday." "Oh, goodness, dear. I didn't mean it had to be that soon. Don't rush your decision. Take your time. Spend a few weekends checking things out. He opened the door and glanced once again at her nameplate. Pretty impressive, he said as he winked back at her. Thanks, I'll be in touch. Goodbye. She gave him a parting wave, and then she turned and walked slowly back to her desk. She sat back down in a semi-daze, the events of the past 15 minutes spinning around in her head. She stared at the outside of the envelope and finally extracted its contents. Inside was just a plain manila folder, but on the tab were neatly printed the words, Dorothy Meyer, Lillian Chase. She suddenly dropped it onto the desk blotter as if it were hot to the touch. I'll look at it when I get home, she told herself. Then she rose and went back to work. As she approached the groupings of paintings she'd been arranging when Alex McHale had interrupted her, she saw it with a fresh eye and realized it wasn't so much that something was off with the way they were displayed, but rather with the paintings themselves. They simply weren't that good. She shook her head and mumbled under her breath, I could do way better than that. Then why don't you? A voice to her left sang out. Lillian jumped and looked with chagrin at her boss, Rebecca Thorndike, who she hadn't noticed since her ubiquitous beige clothing helped her blend in with the bland colors of the walls. This must be my morning for surprises, she thought as she asked, Why don't I what, Rebecca? Rebecca walked toward her and said in a lowered voice, Why don't you do better? Seeing the look that passed over Lillian's face, she added smugly, Yes, I heard you talking to yourself, and I've been telling you for years to bring in some of your work for me to evaluate. I'd love to show it off. Thanks again, and like I've told you, I don't think my work is up to being exhibited here. Mostly, she didn't want Rebecca's opinion of her work because she held her boss's opinion of artwork in low esteem. She felt that Rebecca wouldn't recognize real art if Picasso came back from the dead and pointed it out to her himself. Well, in that case, Lillian, don't judge the art we have on display. She smiled simperingly before walking away. Then she called over her shoulder, At least keep your opinions to yourself. Lillian walked to the paintings and practically ripped them off the wall. As she studied them up close, she could tell that the artist didn't have his own style. He was simply attempting to replicate the techniques he'd studied in art school. She should know, because that was how most of her early works looked too. It was only recently that she'd finally felt like she was coming into her own as an artist. If only she could make a living doing that and quit this job. That didn't give her the time she needed to really immerse herself into her work. Also, she preferred to paint in the mornings when the natural lighting was the best through her apartment's east-facing windows. By the time she got home from work, she had to rely on the unnatural fluorescent glow of her kitchen to paint by, and it just didn't work for her. Weekends weren't enough either because she often had to come into the museum to oversee the loading or unloading of new artwork or handle unforeseen problems that seemed to arise weekly. When she wasn't working, she would attempt to paint. But then she'd often hear complaints from Brad, her boyfriend, who felt himself more and more entitled to infringe upon her free time now that they'd passed the 1-year mark in their relationship. She often wondered how that had happened, because she didn't have especially strong feelings for him, but there wasn't anybody else in her life either, and her friendships were few. So once she'd found somebody to pass the time with, it had just been easier to stay with him. Lately, though, she had been thinking of taking some time away from both him and her job. She wanted more than anything to finish the paintings she had begun, and that were crowding her out of her small apartment. And she wanted to travel back to Europe to revisit the places she'd seen in college, the places that had made her truly want to be a painter. She had vacation time coming to her, so she simply needed to decide when and where she was going to go. But she'd been delaying it because she hated conflict, and she didn't want to break up with Brad or tell him that he couldn't come with her. She realized that this newly acquired house of hers would be just what she needed to step away from her job and her boyfriend for a few days at least and recharge her batteries. She would really enjoy getting away from Omaha and off into the countryside again. Clearwater was almost as small as the town in western Nebraska where she'd been raised, a town so tiny it was sometimes overlooked by cartographers as being too inconsequential to include. She'd grown up surrounded by the sandhills and had walked daily amongst them, sketching wildflowers, the rare tree shading cattle beneath its branches, windmills, and abandoned farmhouses. Early on, her artistic talents had been spotted and nurtured by family and teachers, so after high school graduation, she'd ventured to the other end of the state to study art at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. Various grants had allowed her to travel throughout Western Europe, where not only had she gained inspiration from the everyday sights, but also from the works of Velázquez, El Greco, Da Vinci, Monet, and Goya. She had felt the need for some stability in wages, though, as sales of her paintings were sporadic. So, reluctantly, she accepted a position as assistant curator at the Omaha Institute of Art. Unfortunately, it did not allow her the time she needed to devote to her own artwork, or the proximity to nature that she loved to sketch, and the years had simply passed by without her getting any closer to achieving her dream of being a known artist. As she repositioned the 3 pieces of art onto their own individual easels and placed large potted plants around them, Lillian suppressed a smile as she realized that this mysterious house might be the answer to her prayers. The Clearwater House. Again, if you've enjoyed the first chapter, join me later for more, or please just get your own copy. They're available on Amazon, paperback, or ebook. Or if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read it there too. Thank you, and happy reading.